What does God mean to you? A simple but powerful question. In the church hall in Shreveport, Louisiana, where Bible studies and Sunday dinners are usually held, the atmosphere was different today. The low murmurs, the chairs scraping the wooden floor, all had a tone of anticipation. Donald Trump appeared at the front of the room, the light reflecting off his trademark tan. The hair, the hand gestures, all were familiar to the public. But tonight there was something subdued about his demeanor, perhaps because of the solemn setting, or perhaps because of something deeper inside. Among the elders, families, and curious voters, there was a little girl who seemed out of place, but not small in her presence. 8-year-old Lily, dressed in her best Sunday dress. She clutched an old leather-bound Bible to her bosom, a gift from her late grandmother. The pages were frayed, the gold lettering on the cover faded with age. Her mother had whispered before they arrived that she could ask him, but only if she really wanted to know. Lily had nodded, her small hands clutching the book as if searching for strength. She had practiced the question many times, scribbled in her notebook over and over again late at night. It was not a random question, but one that had weighed on her heart for months. And when the hall opened to the question and answer period, scattered applause as Trump answered each policy question, Lily knew her moment had come. Her hands clenched tighter, her heart pounded, but she stood. When it was her turn, her eyes met Trump's. He paused for a moment, his expression softening. "And what was your question, little girl?" Lily swallowed, her hands shaking as she clutched the Bible. Then she took a deep breath and said in a small but steady voice, "Mr. Trump, what does God mean to you?" The hall was silent, absolute silence. All eyes were on Trump, a man known for his quick, sharp answers. But tonight he didn't answer right away. He looked at Lily, then at the Bible in her hand, and something in him changed. It was a big question. Trump was silent for a moment longer than usual. No one in the hall spoke. No one pressed him to answer right away. Finally, he took a deep breath and his eyes became distant, as if he had been pulled back to another time in his life. "When he was your age," Trump's voice was low and steady, "I had a lot of questions about God, too." He paused for a moment, and his eyes scanned the hall as if to gauge a reaction. But everyone was just listening intently. "My father was a strict man. Every Sunday he took the whole family to church. I remember sitting there looking up at the stained glass windows, listening to God in faith, but wondering if he was really listening to me." Trump looked at Lily. "Have you ever felt like that?" Lily didn't say anything, but she nodded slightly. Trump continued, "My father had a saying that I will always remember. Faith is like a ladder. You climb one rung at a time. Sometimes you're not sure you can go on, but you climb because there's something up there worth reaching for." He chuckled as if remembering the old days. I thought he was just saying that to shut me up. A small chuckle from the crowd eased some of the tension. But Lily kept her eyes serious and watched intently. "But then we grow up. Life isn't as easy as we thought. We face loss and failure, and there are times when we're not sure if God exists." Trump's voice drops. "I was angry with God." The air in the room drops. This isn't the political speeches or the clever answers people are used to hearing. This is raw, unvarnished honesty. "My brother Fred, he was one of the best people I've ever known." Trump pauses, clearing his throat as if trying to steady his voice. "He had a light in him, a kindness I didn't understand at the time." He takes a deep breath before continuing. "But Fred had his own battles, his own demons. And even though our family tried to help, it wasn't enough." The room is silent, not a sound. "When he died, I was angry." Trump admits his voice is shaking. "I was angry with him, angry with myself, and angry with God." Trump paused, his eyes staring into space as if he were facing the memory all over again. "I couldn't understand why God would let someone like Fred go so soon. Why someone like him had to suffer." Lily clutched the Bible in her hand, and for a long time I had turned away from God. For the first time, a slight stir came from the crowd. A few people nodded, perhaps because they had had similar moments. Trump looked down at Lily, but then something changed. He spoke slowly. "I don't know if it was a dream or just a memory, but one night I saw Fred. The room almost held its breath. He smiled at me, that goofy smile he always had, and I heard him say, 'Don't be angry. You have work to do. Trump paused. That was the moment I realized. Faith isn't about understanding everything. It is believing that even when we don't see the whole picture, there is a reason, a purpose. His eyes turned back to Lily. So you ask me, what does God mean to me? Lily nodded slightly. Trump took a breath, his voice slow but steady. He is the reason I keep going. He is the reminder that even when I fall, even when I fail, he hasn't given up on me. Lily looked up, her eyes glistening under the fluorescent lights. She loosened her grip on the Bible. The room was still silent, but this time it wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of people who had just heard something that touched their very hearts. And when Trump paused, something unusual happened. Lily lifted the sleeve of her dress and gently dabbed at a tear that had just rolled down her cheek. But she said nothing, because sometimes the most important moments don't require words. The silence in the hall had not been completely broken. Trump's words seemed to linger in people's minds, reaching deep corners that they rarely revealed. Then from the back of the room, a man stood up. He looked like a laborer, his face tanned, his hands calloused from a lifetime of hard labor. But his eyes were serious as he raised his hand and spoke. Mr. Trump began, his voice low and measured. I have tried to keep my faith strong over the years, but sometimes life keeps testing me. Losing a job, losing a loved one, it feels like God is leaving me. How can you talk about faith when there are times when all I feel is silence? The room was silent. Trump looked at the man and nodded slowly, as if he knew exactly what he was feeling. I understood. He began, not the voice of a politician, but of someone who has gone through dark times. I have been there too. When I lost my brother, I was angry. When I faced failure, I had doubts. But what I have come to realize is that faith is not absolute certainty. It is not perfect. Trump leaned forward, his eyes scanning the audience. We often think that faith means never doubting, never being afraid, but it is not. Faith is keeping going even when we're not sure. It's keeping searching even when we feel lost. He paused and then continued. Faith is not a ready answer. It's a journey. The room was silent, everyone hanging on to every word. Then a small voice rang out, not an adult's, but Lily's. She was still standing there, still clutching her Bible. But this time her voice wasn't shaking. My grandmother used to say that faith is like a seed. Trump turned to her, frowning slightly as if he wanted to hear more. Lily swallowed and continued. You don't always see it grow right away. But just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not growing. You just have to keep tending to it. The room held its breath. Trump smiled slightly. Not the smile of a politician, but of someone who had just heard something simple but profound. My grandmother was a very wise person. He spoke more softly. And you're right. Sometimes we don't see immediate change, but that doesn't mean faith is gone. At that moment, an older woman in the front row slowly stood up. Her gray hair was tied back in a bun, her face lined with age. Her eyes were red, and her voice was shaky when she spoke. I lost my husband last year. She spoke slowly. I haven't felt God's presence since then. I prayed, but there was no answer. I felt like I had lost my faith forever. Every eye in the room turned to her. A few bowed their heads, perhaps because they had gone through the same thing. Trump was silent for a moment. Then he walked to the edge of the stage and looked the woman straight in the eye. It's never too late. He spoke slowly but firmly. Faith is not something you lose forever. It's not gone. It was just waiting for her to find it. The woman took a deep breath, as if the words had awakened something inside her. Trump continued. Sometimes faith doesn't come in big moments. It comes in small things, in a child's words, in a memory of a loved one, or in a quiet night when you realize that despite your doubts, you're still searching. He looked around the room, scanning the faces that were listening, and searching is part of faith. A silence filled the room, but this time it wasn't a silence of disbelief. It was a silence of reflection. Then slowly a clap. Then another. Soon the room was filled with applause, but it wasn't the enthusiastic applause you get at a political rally. This was an acceptance, a connection. Lily looked up at Trump, her eyes shining. The girl said nothing, but Trump nodded at her as if there was a wordless understanding between them. And as the room began to hum with conversation and hugs and handshakes, one thing was clear. This conversation had touched them. The room was no longer a typical political meeting place. It had become a place of connection, of stories of kindred spirits finding common ground in faith and unanswered questions. People were no longer passive spectators. They exchanged glances, knowing nods, warm handshakes. Some quietly wiped away tears, others whispered to their neighbors as if to hold on to the moment a little longer. In the middle of it all, Lily stood there, her arms still tightly around her Bible. But this time she was no longer clutching it like a protective shield. She was holding it like a treasure, a reminder of the most important things she had learned tonight. Trump leaned down and looked her straight in the eye. "Thank you, Lily," he said in a low but sincere voice. "You have so much more courage than that. Many adults we have met." Lily blushed slightly, but she did not turn away. She simply nodded, as if accepting the compliment not only for herself, but also for the woman who had planted the seed of faith in her long before this evening. The room erupted in hugs. A young woman bent down to hold the hand of an older woman who had shared her grief over the loss of her husband. A man placed his hand on the shoulder of the man standing next to him in an unspoken encouragement. The strangers who had entered the hall tonight were no longer strangers. Lily turned to her mother. She saw tears in her mother's eyes, but they were not sad tears. "Would you be proud, Mom?" Lily whispered. Her mother smiled, a gentle but sure smile. She would be more than proud. Lily squeezed her mother's hand, feeling a warmth spread through her. Trump turned to face the crowd one last time. His eyes swept the room, looking at the people who had joined him share this moment. "I didn't come here tonight to preach about faith, but I think we all left here with a lesson." He spoke, his voice not that of an old politician, but of someone who had just experienced something meaningful. Faith is not something to talk about. It is something to live, to feel, to share. Sometimes it comes from the simplest questions and from the people we least expect. He turned to Lily again, then looked out at the audience. "So tonight I leave you with a question. What does faith mean to you?" The room fell silent for a moment. Don't be afraid of your own answer. Don't be afraid if it isn't clear. Because faith is not an absolute certainty, it is a journey we take. A round of applause broke out. This time it wasn't a polite reflex, it was a genuine response, an empathy that came from the heart. The people here tonight will not forget this moment. Lily looked around and saw smiling faces, hugs, and soft eyes. She knew she wasn't the only one who would find an answer tonight. And in her little heart, she knew her grandmother would be happy. Think, share. If this story touches your heart, take a moment to think about your own faith. And if you know someone who might need to hear these words, share it with them today. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiring stories that remind us that sometimes the bravest questions bring the most unexpected answers.